David adjusted his helmet as he crouched in the dark, cold shadows of the high-security compound. His mission was simple: infiltrate, destroy, and escape. He had done it 100 times before, but this time, something was different. The Empire had been enslaving entire alien species for years, but now, David had learned of something far worse. The enslaved people weren't just being used for labor, they were being experimented on, tortured, and killed. He moved quietly through the complex, each step careful, each breath controlled. His pulse was steady, but there was an edge to the air tonight. Tonight, he wasn't just a soldier carrying out orders. He was a man fighting for something bigger than his role in the war. His mission had always been about survival, but now it felt personal. He stopped in front of a heavy metal door, reading the dim, flickering labels on the side. His target was somewhere inside. The room behind this door was a holding area for the enslaved. As he pressed a button on his wrist console, the door slid open with a soft hiss, and David slipped inside. It was worse than he imagined. In the dim light, cages lined the walls, each one containing a different alien species. They were young and old, weak and strong, all bound by chains and helpless. David's heart tightened in his chest, but he pushed those feelings aside. There was no room for emotions now. He quickly scanned the area, looking for his target. Lyra, a member of a powerful telepathic species. His contact had provided no details, only the warning. She's important. He found her at the far end of the room. She was small, her dark hair tangled and matted, her skin pale and bruised. Her eyes were closed as if she was trying to block out the world around her, but David knew that wasn't the case. The moment he entered the room, her eyes snapped open, locking onto his with a sharpness that betrayed the weakness of her body. David hesitated for a moment, his hand hovering over his weapon, but something in her gaze stopped him. She wasn't a victim. She was a survivor. "Hey," he whispered, kneeling beside her cage. "You want to get out of here?" She didn't respond at first, her gaze cautious. She had been through too much to trust anyone easily. David could see the fear in her eyes, but there was something else there too. Hope, buried deep under the layers of pain. He didn't have much time. The facility was going to be crawling with guards soon. He needed to act fast. David reached into his bag, pulling out a small device that would disable the cage's locking mechanism. As he worked quickly, he spoke in a low, reassuring tone, trying to calm the frantic energy in the air. "I'm here to help you," he said softly. "I know you've been through hell, but we can get out of this. I'll get you to safety." Lyra watched him closely, her eyes narrowed with doubt. But there was something about his presence, his voice, the sincerity in his actions, that made her hesitate just long enough. It was the first real kindness she had been shown since being captured by the Empire. With a soft click, the lock on the cage released, and the door swung open. Lyra didn't move at first, her mind racing. She had been trained to fight, to survive, but she wasn't sure how to deal with this situation. Her body was weak from the months of captivity, and the last thing she wanted to do was trust another human. David stood up, offering his hand to her. "Come on. We don't have much time." For a long moment, Lyra didn't take it. Her eyes flickered between his face and the open door. She was torn. She had never been free before. Not like this. There was a part of her that wanted to stay in the cage, to keep her distance from this stranger. But something told her she didn't have a choice. Slowly, she reached out and took his hand. The moment their hands touched, a jolt of electricity shot through her body, not from the physical contact, but from the sudden surge of emotions that washed over her. She felt fear, confusion, and, surprisingly, a small sliver of safety. David didn't let go of her hand as he helped her out of the cage. His grip was steady, and he led her through the dark corridors, staying low to avoid detection. They moved, Swiftly, with David taking the lead and Lyra following closely behind, her mind still reeling from everything that had happened. They passed other cages, other captives, but David knew they couldn't help them all. Not yet. His primary objective was to get Lyra out. He didn't know why she was important, but he could feel it in his gut. There was something about her that made her different from the others. They reached the outer wall, and David's heart raced as he spotted the escape route, a small maintenance tunnel that led to the outside. He had prepared everything, but now, with Lyra by his side, the weight of the decision settled heavily on him. Could he really get them both out of this? "Ready?" he asked, glancing over his shoulder at her. Lyra didn't respond immediately. She was staring at the tunnel entrance, her mind racing with conflicting thoughts. She didn't want to trust this man, but right now he was the only way out. She had no choice. "Let's go," she finally said, her voice soft but determined. As they crawled through the tunnel, David couldn't help but glance back at her. She was silent, but he could sense the tension in her. He wondered what she was thinking. What had she been through? And why, in this moment, had she chosen to trust him? They finally emerged into the open air, and the cool night breeze hit their faces. David paused, taking a deep breath, but he knew they weren't safe yet. The compound would be alerted soon, and the chase would begin. But for the first time in a long while, David felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe, just maybe, they could escape this nightmare. Lyra was free now, but her journey was far from over. And neither of them knew that their connection, which had begun with a simple rescue, would become something far stronger than either could have imagined. David and Lyra didn't speak much as they ran through the dense alien forest. The sounds of the compound's alarms echoed in the distance, a reminder that their time was running out. David kept his focus sharp, his hand gripping the blaster, at his side, always scanning their surroundings. But despite the urgency of the situation, his mind kept returning to Lyra. He had saved her from the cages, but now, as they fled, he had to protect her, no matter the cost. Lyra kept pace with him, but she was struggling. Her body was weaker than she wanted to admit. Months of being confined in a cage had drained her strength. Still, she refused to show any sign of weakness. She was proud, and the last thing she wanted was to rely on a human. She had been taught that humans were just like the Empire, greedy and self-serving. But David had proven that wrong. As they reached a clearing, David paused to check their position. The sky was a deep purple, the first stars starting to appear. The air was thick with the scent of alien trees, and the rustling of leaves was the only sound around them. "We need to keep moving," David said, his voice calm but firm. "There's a small settlement about 10 miles from here. We can hide there for a while." Lyra nodded, still silent. Her mind was too full to respond. She had never been outside the compound before. The world beyond the cage was vast, unfamiliar, and frightening. Everything was different. The air smelled different. The ground felt different beneath her feet, and the stars in the sky were nothing like the lights inside the compound. David led the way, moving with purpose, but he occasionally glanced back at Lyra, making sure she was still behind him. It was clear she was struggling, but she didn't ask for help, didn't show any sign that she was willing to admit how much she was suffering. For that, David admired her. After what felt like hours, they arrived at the small settlement. It was a quiet, simple place, a cluster of huts made from local materials nestled between thick trees. The village seemed peaceful, with no signs of any major military presence, but David knew better than to let his guard down. "We'll stay here for the night," David said. "We'll need to rest, but we can't stay too long. We can't afford to be found." Lyra looked around the settlement, feeling a sense of unease. The people here were peaceful, but she didn't know if she could trust them. Her whole life had been spent around the Empire, surrounded by betrayal and fear. She wasn't sure what to think about this place, but one thing was clear. She couldn't survive on her own. Not yet. David led her into one of the huts. It was small but comfortable, with a soft bed covered in furs and thick blankets. He checked the area to make sure it was safe before turning to Lyra. "Rest. I'll keep watch." Lyra didn't argue. She was exhausted, and though she had always prided herself on her strength, her body was too weak from the months of captivity to keep going. She lay down on the bed, closing her eyes, but her thoughts raced. Why had David saved her? Why had he chosen to risk his life for someone like her, a stranger? She had been nothing but a prisoner, just one more alien in a galaxy full of them. But here she was, free, thanks to him. She turned her head and looked at him. He was standing by the door, his back to her, but she could see the tension in his shoulders. His eyes were scanning the forest, always alert, always on guard. She couldn't help but wonder how long he had been doing this. Fighting, rescuing, living in constant danger. She didn't know what he had been through, but she could tell that he was different from the other soldiers she had seen. There was a kindness in his eyes that wasn't born out of duty but out of genuine care. David glanced back at her, catching her gaze. His eyes softened and he gave her a small nod. "You should sleep. You've been through a lot." Lyra wanted to say something, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, she closed her eyes and let herself drift into a light sleep. It was strange, the way the soft bed felt beneath her. She had never slept in such comfort before. In the cages, she had learned to sleep in the smallest spaces, curled up on cold, hard floors. This was a luxury she hadn't known existed. The night passed slowly, but David stayed awake, vigilant. Every small sound outside made him tense, every rustle in. The trees made his hand instinctively reach for his blaster. He couldn't afford to let his guard down, not even for a second. The Empire would be hunting them by now, and he couldn't risk being caught. In the early hours of the morning, Lyra woke up, her body stiff from lying in one position for so long. She sat up slowly, rubbing her eyes. The light outside was dim, but she could tell it was still early. The world outside was silent, too silent. The stillness made her uneasy. David was still at the door, but now he was looking out at the distant hills. His expression was serious, his eyes scanning the horizon. "We need to move," David said quietly, breaking the silence. "The longer we stay here, the more likely we are to be found." Lyra nodded, feeling a pang of anxiety in her chest. She didn't want to move again, didn't want to leave the safety of this place. But she knew he was right. They couldn't stay. The Empire would find them, and they couldn't afford to be caught. David packed his gear quickly, his movements efficient and precise. Lyra stood and began to gather her own things. She didn't have much, just the clothes on her back and a few items that David had given her to help her survive. But she wasn't complaining. She had learned to survive on less. As they prepared to leave, Lyra looked at David again. She wanted to thank him, to say something meaningful, but the words were stuck in her throat. Instead, she just nodded. David gave her a reassuring smile, the kind of smile that made her believe she wasn't completely alone in this vast, strange world. "Let's go," he said, and together, they stepped out into the unknown, ready to face whatever the galaxy had in store for them. The journey through the alien wilderness was harder than David had expected. The terrain was unforgiving, full of jagged rocks, dense forests, and treacherous paths. Every step felt like a challenge, and every new hill they climbed seemed steeper than the last. Yet, despite the difficulties, David kept pushing forward, determined to get Lyra to safety. Lyra, though silent, kept up with him. She was strong, but even she felt the weight of exhaustion pulling at her. Her body ached from the long hours of travel, and she could feel the weakness in her limbs from the days of captivity. But she refused to show any sign of it. She had always been taught to be strong, to never show weakness to anyone, not even to herself. As the day dragged on, they came across a small stream. The sound of flowing water was a welcome relief after the heavy silence of the forest. David stopped and knelt beside the stream, cupping his hands to drink. Lyra hesitated for a moment, then followed his lead. She kneeled beside him, dipping her hands into the cool water, letting it wash away the grime and dust that had settled on her skin. She couldn't help but glance at David as she drank. He was still on guard, his eyes constantly scanning the surroundings, but there was something in his expression that softened whenever he looked at her. It was a look of concern, not just for her safety, but for her well-being. He wasn't just rescuing her. He was taking responsibility for her, something Lyra had never expected from a human. As they continued their journey, the bond between them grew stronger, though neither of them spoke much about it. It was clear that their relationship was shifting, but the words to describe it seemed elusive. Lyra wasn't sure what to call it. Was it gratitude or something more? David, too, felt the change. He had always been a soldier, trained to focus, on the mission to get the job done and move on. But something about Lyra had stopped him in his tracks. There was strength in her, a quiet power that he found both fascinating and humbling. She wasn't like the others he had met in the war. She was more than just a survivor. She had a fire in her, something that couldn't be put out, no matter how hard the Empire had tried. But what troubled David most was how he had begun to care for her in ways he hadn't expected. He had always kept his distance from the people. He helped. He rescued them, sure, but he never let himself get too involved. It was too dangerous. But with Lyra, he couldn't help himself. She wasn't just another mission. She was someone who had endured unimaginable suffering and yet had a strength that made her more resilient than anyone he had ever known. As the sun began to set, they found a small cave to rest for the night. David set up a small camp, his movements quick and practiced. He was used to survival situations, but this time, things felt different. He wasn't just protecting himself. He was protecting Lyra. And somehow, that responsibility felt heavier than any mission he had ever taken on. Lyra sat a few feet away, watching him. She had always been alone, even in her home world, surrounded. By her people, she had never truly connected with anyone. Her people were reserved, their telepathic abilities making it difficult for them to trust outsiders. She had always kept her distance, keeping her emotions locked away, hidden from the world. But now she couldn't help but feel a strange connection. To David, one she didn't fully understand. She had never trusted humans. They were the ones who had helped the Empire capture her people, who had watched as her world was torn apart. But David was different. He didn't feel like the others. He was kind, but strong. He didn't try to push her, didn't ask her to open up before she was ready. He just let her be. As night fell, they sat by the fire, the warmth of the flames, flickering in the cold air. Lyra wrapped her arms around her knees, her gaze lost in the dancing flames. David sat across from her, his face illuminated by the firelight. For a long time, neither of them spoke. The silence between them was comfortable, even though both of them were aware of the unspoken tension in the air. David broke the silence first. "How are you feeling?" Lyra didn't look at him. "Tired," she said simply. Her voice was soft, but there was an edge to it, as if she was holding back something. David didn't press her. He had learned by now that Lyra wasn't someone who opened up easily. She carried her pain silently, tucked away behind walls that were hard to break down. But David was patient. He didn't expect her to tell him everything, but he wanted her to know she didn't have to carry it alone. "I'm sorry for what you've been through," David said quietly, his voice filled with sincerity. No one should have to suffer like that. Lyra's eyes flickered toward him, but she didn't say anything. She wasn't ready to talk about it, not yet. Instead, she just nodded, a small, almost imperceptible gesture that told him she had heard him. David sat back, letting her have her space. He didn't want to push her, but he could feel the weight of her silence. It wasn't just the physical scars she carried, it was the emotional wounds. The things that couldn't be seen, but were there all the same. After a long while, Lyra spoke again, her voice barely above a whisper. "I've never been free before," she said, her words hanging in the air between them. David looked at her, his expression softening. "Now you are." Lyra met his gaze for the first time, her eyes searching his face. She could see the sincerity in his eyes, the way he looked at her not as a prisoner, but as a person. It was something she had never experienced before. For the first time in her life, she felt like she mattered to someone. She didn't know what the future held or what would happen once they reached safety. But for the first time, she didn't feel completely alone. The days passed in a blur of endless walking, hiding, and brief moments of rest. The alien landscape became more familiar to Lyra, though the constant sense of danger never truly left her. Every rustling leaf, every shifting shadow, made her tense. Her mind was always alert, her instincts never quite able to relax. And yet, despite the fear that lingered like a cloud, she felt something else, a strange sense of freedom. For the first time in her life, she was no longer confined by the walls of the Empire's prison. She was alive. She was free. But freedom came at a cost. David was always on edge. Every sound in the distance, every flicker of movement in the trees made him tighten his grip on his weapon. His years as a soldier had trained him to be constantly aware of his surroundings, and now, with Lyra beside him, that vigilance was even more crucial. She had become more than just a mission. She was someone he cared about, and the thought of losing her, of failing to keep her safe, gnawed at him. They had made it out of the Empire's reach for now, but David knew it wouldn't be long before they sent a search party. He had seen enough to know how the Empire operated. They would stop at nothing to capture or kill anyone who tried to escape their control. As they traveled through the thick forest, David noticed something strange. The ground seemed to vibrate beneath his feet, faint but unmistakable. It was a sound he recognized from his time as a soldier, heavy machinery moving quickly, getting closer. "They're here," David muttered, his voice low, urgent. "We need to move, now." Lyra's heart skipped a beat. She had heard the sound, too, and her body reacted instinctively. Her hand went to the small blade she carried with her, though she knew it wouldn't be enough to stop what was coming. She looked at David, who was already scanning the trees, his mind working quickly to find their next move. "What do we do?" Lyra asked, her voice steady, but the anxiety was clear in her eyes. David didn't hesitate. "We run. We can't fight them here." Without waiting for a response, he turned and began to move, his pace quickening. Lyra followed closely behind, her heart pounding in her chest. She didn't question David's orders. She trusted him completely. In a world where trust was a rare commodity, she had come to rely on him, to believe in him, in ways she hadn't believed in anyone before. They ran for what felt like hours, dodging through the trees, weaving between massive rocks and thick brush. David led the way, his eyes always scanning for danger. Lyra followed, her legs burning with each step, but she kept up. She couldn't afford to fall behind, not when their lives were on the line. The sound of the machines grew louder, closer. David's breath was quick and shallow, his body pushing beyond its limits. He could feel the sweat dripping down his face, stinging his eyes. But he didn't slow down. Not for a second. Lyra was right behind him. But he knew they couldn't outrun the Empire forever. Then, just as he was about to give a signal to change direction, he heard something else, a crackling in the underbrush ahead. A figure stepped out from behind a tree, blocking their path. David's hand immediately went to his weapon, his heart racing. But the figure didn't move. Instead, it stood there, watching them with an intensity that made David freeze. "Wait," the figure said, its voice deep and calm. "I'm not here to hurt you." David's finger hovered over the trigger, but he didn't fire. His instincts told him to stay cautious, but there was something about the figure's voice that made him hesitate. The figure stepped forward slowly, and David could see it more clearly now. A tall alien with pale blue skin and sharp features. It was dressed in simple, weathered clothing, and its eyes gleamed with intelligence. The creature wasn't armed, but there was an air of authority about it that made David lower his weapon just a fraction. "You're human," the alien said, its voice tinged with curiosity. "I did not expect to find a human out here, especially one who has rescued one of our kind." David didn't lower his guard completely. He knew better than to trust anyone too easily, especially in a situation like this. But he was tired. They were both tired. And something about this alien's presence felt different. "We're not here to fight," David said cautiously. "We just need to get away from the Empire." The alien nodded slowly, its gaze moving over Lyra, who was standing slightly behind David, her hand still gripping the blade at her side. "I can help you," the alien said, its voice low. "But you must trust me. The Empire is not the only threat. Out here, there are others who would see you dead just for being different." David's brow furrowed. "Who are you? And why should we trust you?" The alien smiled, though it was a strange, almost sad smile. "Because I know what it's like to be hunted. I know what it's like to lose everything. And I know the price of freedom." David hesitated for a moment. He wanted to trust this stranger, but the risk was too great. If they were being set up, Lyra stepped forward then, her voice calm but firm. "We need help," she said. "We can't keep running forever." David looked at her, his expression softening. He didn't want to admit it, but she was right. They were running out of time, and the Empire wouldn't stop coming. Maybe this alien, whoever they were, was their best chance. "All right," David said finally, his voice steady. "We'll trust you, but no tricks. If you lead us into a trap, I won't hesitate to fight." The alien nodded, its expression serious. "I understand. Follow me. There's a safe place not far from here. It's hidden. The Empire won't find you there." Without another word, the alien turned and started walking, moving with purpose through the dense forest. David and Lyra followed, but their senses were on high alert. They couldn't let their guard down yet, not until they knew for sure whether they were safe. As they moved deeper into the forest, David couldn't shake the feeling that things were about to get a lot more complicated. The road to safety was never easy, and they had only just begun to realize how many dangers lay ahead. But for now, they had no choice but to trust the alien in front of them. It was their only chance. The safe haven the alien had led them to was unlike anything David and Lyra had ever imagined. Nestled deep in the heart of the forest, hidden by thick layers of trees and natural barriers, it was a small village that seemed to blend perfectly with its surroundings. The homes were built into the trees, made from sturdy vines and natural wood. There were no signs of technology, only a peaceful, almost timeless existence. David and Lyra followed the alien through the village, their eyes wide as they took in the strange yet calming atmosphere. Children played in the open areas, their laughter echoing through the trees. The air was clean, fresh, and sweet with the scent of blooming flowers. It was a stark contrast to the harsh, cold environment of the Empire's prisons and the military compounds they had escaped from. They were led to a small hut at the edge of the village, far from the watchful eyes of the villagers. The alien stopped at the entrance and turned to them, its expression serious. "You are safe here, for now," it said, its voice low and steady. "But you cannot stay long. The Empire will search for you relentlessly, and the longer you remain here, the greater the risk to all of us." David nodded, his mind already working. They had come this far, but the road ahead was still uncertain. They had to keep moving, but for the first time in days they could rest, and he knew they needed to, physically and emotionally. Inside the hut, the air was warm and smelled faintly of herbs. It was a simple space, with only a few pieces of furniture, mats on the floor, a small table, and a set of shelves lined with dried plants and jars. A soft bed made from woven fibers sat in the corner. It was the first bed either of them had slept in that didn't feel like a makeshift shelter. David sat on the edge of the bed, rubbing his face with his hands. It had been a long journey, and the tension in his body was starting to catch up with him. He hadn't realized just how much he had been carrying until now. He glanced at Lyra, who was standing near the door, still holding herself in a tense, guarded posture. Lyra hadn't said much since they arrived. Her silence was heavy, a stark contrast to the bustling village outside. She had always been the strong, silent type, but David could sense there was something more behind her quiet demeanor. There was a weight in her eyes that hadn't been there before. He could only guess what she was feeling, but he knew she was struggling. He took a deep breath, trying to shake off the exhaustion, then spoke softly. "Lyra, we can't keep running forever. We need to figure out what's next." Lyra turned to him, her face unreadable. She had been so focused on survival, on getting away from the Empire, that she hadn't allowed herself to think beyond that. But now, with some space to breathe, her mind had started to catch up to the reality of what they had escaped. They were free, but the danger hadn't passed. It had only shifted. "I know," she replied, her voice low and quiet. "But I don't know where to go from here. I've never been outside the Empire's control. I don't even know who I can trust anymore." David nodded, his own thoughts mirroring hers. "I understand. It's hard to trust anyone, especially after everything you've been through. But I think we can make it. Together." Lyra glanced at him, her eyes lingering on his face. There was something in his gaze, a kindness, a sincerity, that made her pause. She had never been good at accepting help. Her people had always been self-reliant, and she had learned to rely on herself above all else. But David, he was different. He had risked everything to get her out of that prison, and he had never asked for anything in return. In some strange way, she felt safe with him. She wasn't used to feeling that way. "You've done more than anyone else ever would," she said, quietly, her voice tinged with emotion. "I don't know how to thank you." David shook his head. "You don't need to thank me. I didn't do it for any reward. I did it because you deserved better than what the Empire gave you." Lyra's heart tightened at his words. She had never heard anyone speak like that before. She had been so used to being seen as nothing more than a tool, a prize to be won, or a slave to be broken. But David had treated her like an equal, like a person who mattered. She took a deep breath, feeling a surge of emotion that she hadn't allowed herself to feel in a long time. She didn't want to admit it, but the connection between them was undeniable. She wasn't sure when it had started, but somewhere along the way she had begun to care for him, in a way that went beyond simple gratitude. David seemed to sense the change in her. He stood up slowly, walking toward her with cautious steps, as though unsure of what to say or do next. "I'm not asking for anything," he said, his voice gentle. "I just want you to know that you're not alone anymore. You don't have to carry this burden by yourself. Lyra met his gaze, her chest tight. For the first time in as long as she could remember, she allowed herself to relax, just a little. She had spent so much time fighting, so much time pushing people away, that the idea of letting someone in felt like a dangerous gamble. But David, he had shown her nothing but kindness, nothing but a willingness to protect her, even when it seemed impossible. For a moment there was silence between them, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was soft, filled with an understanding that neither of them had words for. Slowly, Lyra let out a breath, her shoulders dropping as if the weight of her past had lifted, if only for a moment. "I don't know what the future holds," she said softly, her voice almost a whisper. "But I'm glad you're here." David smiled, the tension in his body easing. "I'm glad I'm here too." For a long time they stood in silence, the weight of the world outside forgotten for a brief moment. They were both tired, both uncertain of what the next day would bring, but for the first time in a long while, they didn't feel completely alone. The quiet bond between them was something neither of them had expected, but it was something they both needed. And in this uncertain world, it was enough, for now. The days following their arrival in the hidden village were filled with a strange mixture of peace and tension. The village itself offered shelter, a brief respite from the constant pursuit of the Empire. But the looming threat of discovery never left their minds. They knew that staying in one place for too long was dangerous, that the Empire's soldiers would eventually track them down. David and Lyra had learned to be cautious, always moving at night, always staying one step ahead. Still, in the quiet moments, when the stars filled the sky and the village was silent, they found themselves drawn closer to each other. The walls they had built over the years were beginning to crumble, and they allowed themselves to trust one another in ways neither of them had ever expected. David had always been a soldier, a man of duty, trained to focus on the mission. But over the days spent with Lyra, he had realized something he hadn't anticipated. He cared for her, deeply. It wasn't just gratitude for her survival, or the bond formed through shared danger. It was more than that. He found himself thinking about her even when she wasn't around, wondering if she was all right, hoping she was safe. And he couldn't shake the feeling that, no matter what happened, he wanted to be by her side. Lyra, too, had felt the change. It had started with the simple things. The way David always made sure she was okay, the way he spoke to her with kindness and respect, the way he never treated her as anything less than a person, even though she had been nothing more than a prisoner to so many others. Over time, her initial resistance had softened. She began to look at David differently, no longer just as the man who had freed her, but as someone she trusted, someone she cared for. But even with these feelings growing between them, neither of them spoke openly about it. They didn't need to. The quiet understanding between them was enough for now. They both knew the dangers that lay ahead, the risks they faced, but there was a peace in knowing that they no longer had to face them alone. One evening, after a long day of traveling, they found themselves resting in a small, secluded clearing. The sun had set, and the world around them was bathed in the soft light of the moon. The forest was alive with the sounds of crickets and the rustling of leaves, and for the first time in what felt like forever, there was no rush, no fear. They were simply two people sitting together in the calm of the night. David glanced over at Lyra, who was sitting beside him, her eyes staring up at the sky, lost in thought. The way the moonlight caught her features made her look almost otherworldly, and for a moment, David felt as though they were the only two people in the universe. "Lyra," he said softly, his voice breaking the silence. "What happens now?" Lyra turned to him, her gaze meeting his. The question had been hanging in the air for a while now. What was their future? They couldn't keep running forever. They couldn't keep hiding in the shadows of the forest. forever looking over their shoulders. Sooner or later, they would have to face what was ahead. "I don't know," she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. "I've never had a future. I've always just tried to survive day by day." David nodded, understanding what she meant. The Empire had stolen so much from her, and for so long she had been forced to live in a world where survival was all that mattered. But now she had a chance at something different, a chance at a life outside of the Empire's grasp. "And so did he." "You do now," David said softly, his words carrying a quiet promise. "We both do." Lyra's heart skipped a beat at his words. She had spent so much time pushing people away, building walls around herself, that she hadn't allowed herself to dream of a future beyond survival. But now, as she looked at David, she realized that maybe she didn't have to do it alone. Maybe, just maybe, they could build something together. "I want to believe that," she said, her voice filled with a mixture of hope and uncertainty. "But the Empire—" "We'll deal with them," David interrupted, his tone firm but gentle. "Together. We're stronger than they think." Lyra looked at him for a long moment, her eyes searching his face for any sign of doubt, but all she saw was determination. He truly believed what he was saying, and for the first time, she allowed herself to believe it too. "I'll stay with you," she said finally, her voice steady. "I don't know what comes next, but I know I don't want to face it alone." David's heart surged at her words, but he didn't speak right away. Instead, he reached out and gently took her hand in his. It was a simple gesture, but it carried more meaning than either of them could put into words. It was a promise, an unspoken vow that no matter what happened, they would face it together. For a long moment, they sat there in silence, their hands intertwined, watching the stars above. The weight of everything they had been through, the pain, the loss, the fear, was still there, lingering in the background. But for the first time, it didn't feel so heavy. They had each other now, and that made all the difference. The next morning, they packed up their things and set out again. The village they had found refuge in was no longer safe. The Empire would be looking for them, and staying in one place for too long was too risky. But as they moved through the forest, side by side, there was a new sense of purpose in their steps. Lyra no longer felt like a prisoner, chained by her past. She was free now, free to choose her own path, free to build a future of her own. And for the first time in her life, she wasn't alone. David had given her that. And in return, she had given him her trust. They were a team now, partners in more ways than one, and whatever the future held, they would face it together. As the day wore on, they found themselves walking with a sense of determination. The road ahead was still uncertain, and the Empire's threat hadn't disappeared. But for the first time, Lyra wasn't afraid of what lay ahead. She had found something worth fighting for, and someone who would fight by her side. And for David, the future no longer seemed like a distant, unreachable goal. It was something they could build together, one step at a time.